Bodies in the street, controversial autopsies, and the intervention of an American president. It's been over 50 years since the Munich Olympics Massacre stunned the world, but we now have a clearer picture of what happened to the victims' remains. When the Black September terrorists forced their way into the apartments of the Israeli Olympic delegation, one of the first people they ran into was wrestling coach Moshe Weinberg. Almost immediately, Weinberg was forced to lead the intruders to the rest of the athletes, all while being held at the end of a gun. Weinberg's intentions at that exact moment are somewhat up for debate, but he was ultimately shuttled back into his original apartment along with the rest of the hostages. However, the athletes tried to fight back or escape. In the chaos, Weinberg tried to take one of the terrorists' guns. His attempt was nearly successful, but that wasn't enough, and he was shot and killed in the process. The aftermath of his death, though, was what proved particularly dark. The precise events are somewhat lost, but members of the East German delegation, who were being housed directly across the street, were able to see exactly what happened. They watched as the terrorists callously tossed Weinberg's body into the middle of the street, right in front of the entrance to the Israeli athletes' housing, and then just left it there. Most of the casualties suffered during the Munich massacre took place at the Fürstenfeldbruck Air Base, except for two, Moshe Weinberg and weightlifter Yossef Romano. As it's understood, both Weinberg and Romano took advantage of a moment of confusion to try and disarm the terrorists, Romano even doing so despite an injury. Both were shot in the attempt. Weinberg's fate you already know. If you think that was done as a warning, Romano's was even more of a statement. Reports unveiled years later revealed that Romano was left to die on the floor. According to reports, the terrorists then did some things to him that we don't even want to bring up here. It's believed that the graphic stuff happened after they killed him, but we do know that the thing that they did was in front of the other hostages. Let's just put it this way. They assured he wasn't going to father any children in case he wasn't dead. Details beyond that are few and far between, beyond the assumption that the treatment of Romano and the decision to leave his body in plain view on the floor was meant to act as a grisly warning. The atmosphere of the autopsy room housing the victims of the Munich massacre was a somber one. Silent even, according to those who were present as the doctors did their work. This was because the Israeli government had sent a request to Munich asking that they be brought home as quickly as possible, hastening the autopsy process. The official autopsy report, at least as it was shown to the public at the time, revealed that most of the Israeli delegation was killed by gunshot wounds. Weinberg and Romano were both shot and killed at the Olympic Village, and 8 of the other 9 died of gunshot wounds sustained while trapped in the helicopters that took them to the airfield.
They go to an airport and they have a big shootout, and everybody's killed.
The last hostage, David Berger, also suffered gunshot wounds but died of smoke inhalation. This was a result of a grenade thrown into one of the helicopters by the terrorists. There was relatively little time that passed between the victims of the Munich massacre being returned to Israel and their burials, a part of Jewish law. On top of that, though, there was a strange level of secrecy surrounding the state of their bodies. Romano's widow has explained that the bodies were identified by friends or family in Munich, but even then, information was clearly kept hidden. Romano's uncle was given a photo, but it only showed his face. Because of that, speculation abounded regarding what exactly had happened, because none of the victims' families truly knew what had happened. For 20 years, the families were denied answers, until 1992 when an anonymous German government official released 80 pages of reports and documents to the families. Eventually, they were also given photos which they saw as evidence of torture. The photos themselves were described as being especially gruesome. All of the victims of the Munich massacre were given autopsies after their bodies were retrieved from the airfield. Generally speaking, the results of these autopsies aren't all too heavily contested. However, that's not to say there isn't some controversy surrounding them, and that mostly regards how accurately they reported on the state of those bodies. The families of the Israeli victims have made claims that the bodies of their loved ones were brutalized, an apparent indication of torture, but German officials have made very different claims in response. Wolfgang Eisenmenger was one of the forensic scientists present during the autopsy, and he has since made statements that there was nothing surprising about the state of the bodies. According to Eisenmenger, everything he saw on that day perfectly aligned with a previously accepted version of events. According to Der Spiegel, he said, none of the victims showed indications of torture. Eisenmenger's statement did add a specific detail that we alluded to earlier regarding the condition of Yossef Romano's body, and it contradicts the ghastly claim. His assessment was seemingly also supported by the then Interior Minister Hans-Dietrich Genscher, who claimed that he saw no signs of torture himself. All the same, the victims' families believe it to be something of a cover-up, pointing to the botched rescue attempt. The immediate aftermath of the Munich massacre was marred by a rather controversial decision. At the memorial service held on September 6, the International Olympic Committee chairman Avery Brundage announced that the Games would resume at the conclusion of the service.
The Games must go on.
The decision heaped criticism upon Brundage, who was called out on his callousness. Many athletes believe the Olympics should have been canceled altogether. Israeli Olympic swimmer Shlomit Nir Tor told I-24 News, "The most shattering thing for us was that after the ceremony, the Games continued as if nothing had happened. How was this possible? We had just lost 11 members of our delegation." Insulted, the rest of the Israeli delegation returned back home, effectively traveling alongside the coffins carrying their murdered colleagues. The bodies of the victims were flown to the airport in Lod, Israel, arriving on September 7th. There, they were greeted with the nation's flag flying at half-staff, a huge crowd of mourners waiting for their arrival, and a public memorial service attended not only by their families, but also by a huge crowd who had gathered there to honor the victims. From there, all of the caskets were transported to their own funeral services at local cemeteries across the country. 4 of them, however, were all buried together in a joint grave located just outside Tel Aviv. Their service was attended by 5,000 mourners, including Tel Aviv's chief rabbi and other members of the Olympic delegation. Unlike much of the rest of the Israeli delegation sent to Munich in 1972, David Berger wasn't actually born in Israel. He was from the United States, born and raised in Cleveland, Ohio. He'd only moved to Israel 2 years prior, getting himself a dual citizenship in both countries so that he could make the Munich Olympics as a weightlifter. As such, while the bodies of the rest of the Israeli delegation were sent back to Israel, Berger was instead returned to his family in the U.S. President Richard Nixon arranged the entire process. As the story goes, Nixon personally reached out to Berger's parents to offer his condolences and any help the family might need.
I express sympathy on behalf of all of the American people for the victims of this murderous act that has occurred at the Olympic Village.
Nixon organized a military cargo plane to return his body to the U.S. Air Force officers accompanied Berger's coffin aboard the long flight to Cleveland Hopkins International Airport, where they arrived on September 7th to a crowd of reporters. After Berger was returned home in Cleveland, the services and memorials for him attracted considerable attention from the press. Reporters waited on the tarmac as the Air Force jet carrying his body arrived. The reporters were addressed by Buddy Rosenthal, the spokesman for the Berger family. Rosenthal mentioned grief as well as the hope that Berger's needless death, as well as those of the rest of the Israeli delegation, would unite the world in its recognition of a desire for peace and the end of acts of terror. He added the sentiment that there was no need for revenge. Very similar statements were made at Berger's funeral, held the next day at the temple near the family's home. With 800 people attending the service, Rabbi Arthur J. Leleveld condemned calls for revenge made by other groups. He explained, "The calls for violent reprisals that have come from a few unrepresentative extremists reflect the very inhumanity and insane criminality that we abhor." Leleveld went on to add that the true way to honor the victims of the Munich massacre was to continue to search for a peaceful solution that they could be proud of. Understandably, the Munich massacre is mostly remembered for the deaths of the 11 members of the Israeli Olympic delegation, and the long history of tension and conspiracy that spawned from it. That said, they weren't the only people who died at the airbase. Among the victims was 32-year-old West German police brigadier Anton Fliegerbauer. As it turned out, September 5th was actually the start of his vacation, but Fliegerbauer was called to the airfield nonetheless, where he was thrust into a situation he and many of his colleagues were woefully unprepared for. He was killed in a gunfight with the terrorists. On September 8th, he was subsequently given a large and well-attended state funeral. The mayor and Bavarian minister-president were there to pay their respects and acknowledge him as a hero, while a representative of the Israeli prime minister recognized his sacrifice on behalf of the people of Israel. Unfortunately, Fliegerbauer's death was also twisted by West German officials for their own ends. They saw it as a way to paint themselves as a victim in the tragedy, a sentiment that surely wasn't shared by the Israeli people at large. There are a few aspects of the Munich massacre that have called the government of West Germany into question. For starters, there's the dismally planned and executed attempt at a rescue. Then there are the warnings the police received that this exact thing would happen, only to be dismissed. But the most questionable thing might have to do with the treatment of the Palestinian terrorists in the aftermath. The 3 surviving terrorists were held in Munich pending their trial, where many expected them to face justice for one of the worst crimes committed in Olympic history. At least until October 29th, when 2 more Black September terrorists hijacked a Lufthansa flight and demanded the return of their 3 colleagues. It was a demand that the West German government gave into almost immediately. The surviving terrorists returned to Libya and were seen as heroes. But what about the 5 other terrorists who were killed during the Munich Olympics massacre? Their bodies were also sent to Libya, where a massive public funeral was held for them. It was an event that was attended by more than 30,000 people, including the families of the deceased, who were flown in by the Libyan government. The mourners crowded to catch glimpses of the men they saw not as terrorists who slaughtered innocent people, but noble martyrs who'd given their lives for a just cause.